Something is very wrong with the way virologists have been competing with each other to do ever more fancy experiments with viruses. It's like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. Lab leaks are all too common.
You must stay at home. Stay at home.
To find scientists conspiring among themselves to tell a different story in public from what they believe in private is really shocking. They just won't look at this. They want it to go away.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined in conversation with Matt Ridley. Matt, you've been a science writer for several decades now. You're a former peer in the House of Lords. You've written an excellent book, co-authored, called Viral, The Search for the Origins of COVID-19. We're several years on from the pandemic. It's killed around 28 million people, put us in lockdown for 2 years, caused absolutely, perhaps unprecedented economic destruction for a single event. And yet we still have no official explanation as to what caused the virus. How do we account for that?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? If a plane crashes and kills 200 people, we turn over every stone to find out how and why it happened. We've killed, 10 million times that, or whatever it is, because if you take into account the people who were killed by lockdowns, by the effects of that terrible period. It's the worst catastrophe in a century that compared, since the 1918 flu to come out of biology. There's a very strong probability, as I now think, I didn't think to start with, but I do now think, that it began with an accident in a laboratory. And we aren't pushing to find that out. Most of the media, most of politics, most of science is just hoping the topic goes away. And I don't see that we should.
And in your view, is there a smoking gun, or is there something, how close can we get to a smoking gun, if you like, that it might have come from a laboratory, specifically, of course, laboratory in Wuhan?
Well, Alina Chan and I both think that the closest thing to a smoking gun, it's not a smoking gun, but it's a pretty hot weapon, is a document called Defuse, which came into our hands and the hands of the public in September 2021, just as we were finishing our book. But more importantly, in the end of 23, we found an earlier version of that document, and that told us that filled in some crucial gaps in the first version. And what that document was a proposal by an American institution called the EcoHealth Alliance, with the collaboration of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, to do a series of experiments on bat SARS-like beta coronaviruses. And one of those experiments was to put a particular sequence into such a virus for the first time. And that's the sequence that turned up roughly 2 years later in SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID. And to start with the first version of the document, we weren't quite certain that they were going to put it in the right place in the virus.
Yes.
And we weren't quite certain that they were talking about SARS-like viruses, but quite distant from SARS itself. And so we from the earlier drafts, we now know that's exactly what they were talking about, putting it at the S1, S2 junction in the spike gene of a SARS-BICO virus for the first time. Now, just to sort of put it in context, that means we now know that in exactly the right city, in exactly the right couple of years, they had a plan to put exactly the right sequence into exactly the right part of exactly the right gene of exactly the right virus that would create this, that would create, it's a blueprint for making SARS-CoV-2, pretty precisely, right? Now, the other thing that second draft of that document, the early draft of that document showed us was that they planned to do it at biosafety level 2. And there's a marginal document, marginal notes exchange in the document between Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance and Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina, in which Daszak says there's a great advantage in doing this work in China because we can do it at biosafety level 2, which is highly cost effective.
So
a
that's
lot
less,
cheaper.
and that's because it's less safe, presumably.
It's much less safe. It's basically you wear a mask and gloves and nothing else. Whereas biosafety level 3, you've got to have a negative pressure cabinet and the positive pressure suit comes at biosafety level 4, but you get the point. It's a really big deal. It's much more expensive. It's much more cumbersome, much more time consuming. And Barrick replied, US scientists will freak out if you say that, because that really isn't safe. And so the later draft says biosafety level 3,
right?
so as not to freak out scientists. So it's really very shocking to find that something this close to being a precise recipe for making this virus did exist. And there is a very easy way for the Wuhan Institute of Virology to clear its name, and that is to publish the database that it had on all the viruses in its possession, all the information it had about all of them. And the reason, and it took that database offline on the 12th of September, 2019.
Right.
About 3 months before the pandemic began, about 2 months before the pandemic began in earnest. Now, why did it do that? Why won't it share it? They say, well, people might hack it if we share it. That's a meaningless remark. If you share something, it's not hackable anymore.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean, you only hack
and
secret
it's only
things.
Information, isn't it? It's not actually
Exactly.
access to the viruses themselves.
So, and to put it in a much more topical context, we know that they specialized in growing live viruses from samples they got from bats. And they basically managed to the word is isolate, but that really means grow, 16 different viruses in that lab. It's very easy to identify that you've got a virus in a sample. It's not very easy to then recover live viruses and infect cells with them and so on. But they did it with 16 different viruses that we know of. They were called WIV1, WIV2 through to WIV16. So it's quite simple. We know that WIV12 and 13 came from the very site where the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2 was later found in bats.
Yeah.
A mine shaft in a place called Mojiang, 1,000 miles south of Wuhan. And we know what WIV16 is and all the other ones. Until last week, we didn't know much about WIV14, but we now know that it's actually a polio virus. It's nothing to do with bats or anything like that. But it's a polio virus that leaked from a lab.
Right.
Not necessarily in Wuhan, but that was out of circulation. It didn't exist in the wild. It was only available in labs. But the Pasteur Institute has just managed to prove just this week that actually that was what they isolated. And therefore, it's likely that somewhere in China, they were trying to make vaccines against polio and they had an accident and it started infecting people and a kid got sick with polio and they recovered this virus and were able to grow it. Now, WIV15 is the only one we have absolutely no information about. Now, is it, I asked on Twitter this week, is that SARS-CoV-2 or its ancestor?
Yeah.
Please, Shi Zhengli, the head of that lab, and Jane Q, the Chinese journalist who acts as her mouthpiece, please will you tell us? Answer came there, none, of course, but I'm still asking.
And just so the viewers can understand, lab leaks are not necessarily uncommon. You're not suggesting something that's entirely outlandish by saying that COVID may have escaped from a lab by accident.
Well, unfortunately, lab leaks are all too common. That's not to say that all labs are unsafe. Most experiments are done safely, the vast majority. But viruses are very difficult to contain, and accidents do happen. Just to give you a very obvious example, SARS, the cause of the 2003-04 epidemic in China, which was stamped out very quickly in a few months, was then studied in labs in China and elsewhere afterwards. And we know of at least 6 occasions on which researchers got infected with it by accident. Once in Taiwan, once in Singapore, and at least 4 times in Beijing. in all of those cases, except the Taiwanese case, we don't know how it happened.
Yeah.
There wasn't a drop test tube, which there was in Taiwan. The researcher thought they did everything right, but nonetheless, they fell sick a few days later. In one of the Beijing cases, she infected her mother, who died. It was a significant event. And this is only one of many examples of lab leaks. Foot and mouth disease, which is also a virus, an animal virus, turned up on a farm in 2007 in Surrey, 13 miles from the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth virus. Now, nobody said, well, it's probably just a coincidence.
Yeah.
They said, hang on a minute. And they went through the records, and sure enough, the contractor who'd been working on the farm the week before the virus turned up had been working at the lab 10 days before that, plugging a broken drain or something.
Yeah.
And he transported it one to the other. So in this case, we're talking about an outbreak that happens even closer to a lab that we know was working on these kinds of viruses. More than any other lab in the world, actually, was working on these kinds of viruses. And also, you don't always find out immediately that a lab leak is a cause of an outbreak. There's a very famous case from 1979 in Sverdlovsk, which is now called Ekaterinburg in Russia, where the Western intelligence agencies said, you've had an anthrax outbreak in this city, haven't you? Did it come from your biological warfare lab in the city? Certainly not, said the Soviets. Don't be ridiculous. We'll invite in an international team, we'll show them around, and we'll show that these 65 people died of food poisoning. Well, the international team was convinced and went away, and the whole story went away. 12 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, and people started coming out, and one of the scientists came and said, I'll tell you what happened. We were working on anthrax as a biological warfare agent. We left the lid off the filter off the air duct by mistake. We sent a plume of anthrax over the city. We killed 65 people. And that's the story. So it took a long time, and it took a change of regime, but we did eventually find out what happened in that case.
And in the case of COVID, why has no one been able to come up with an animal source? Because that's the current argument that most leading scientists would make, but the evidence just doesn't seem to be there, or is the argument too weak? Why is there a possibility that you could be wrong?
There's always a possibility that I could be wrong. And I started out thinking that even while we were investigating, even after we've decided to write a book, and our book, by the way, is balanced. We investigate the animal theory as hard as we can, and then we investigate the lab theory, and we come out leaning towards the lab theory, but not as strongly as we do now. I mean, Lena Chan and I now have both become much more convinced that it was the lab leak. But there's always a possibility that it was an animal, and there've been papers published which claim, yes, suddenly we found the animal. It's a raccoon dog. Case closed. The BBC, even ran a thing saying, infected raccoon dog found. This is just not true. It's a great exaggeration of a really poor piece of data, which doesn't help the case one bit, really. And that is that that market in Wuhan, where the outbreak first was detected, and which was thought by the authorities to be where it had started, because that's how SARS started. It started in a market. But in the case of SARS, they quickly found infected palm civets, which are these small mammals, infected food handlers, infected animal vendors. There was a very clear pattern of people and animals who'd been in close proximity infecting each other, and they eventually traced it back to the palm civet, somehow picking up this virus from bats on a palm civet farm. Such things exist in Western China. Right. Well, in this case, they said, right, my goodness, we'll close the market, we'll shut it down, we'll swab it, we'll find the sources. And we'll say that anyone who comes out of that market who gets a nasty sniffle, we'll test them to see if they've got this disease. So sure enough, the early cases cluster around the market because, you had to be either in the market or treated in a hospital near the market to get even a possibility of a diagnosis of COVID to start with. So it's a circular argument, that. But they did test all the animals they found in the market, including strays. They found a stray weasel in the market somehow, which is quite clever. And they tested about 400 different animals, and they found none of them infected with a coronavirus at all.
Yeah.
Later, it emerged that there had been illegal sales of mammals in that market, including raccoon dogs. And it emerged that one of the stalls where the raccoon dogs were being sold also had traces of the virus next to it. Well, we found the virus all over the market. I mean, that's not a problem. It's on the countertops, it's on the doorknobs, it's in the sewage, etc., because there were infected people in the market. But it's the human version that we find. We've never found a non-human version. And you would find a few genetic tweaks. In the case of SARS, there was rapid genetic change from the virus that infected palm civets to the ones that infected humans. So we don't find an animal version of the virus. Now, the raccoon dog story fell apart because what happened was that there was traces of the virus and traces of raccoon dog DNA in the same sample in one case. Right. But of course, there are traces of the virus and traces of human DNA in lots of cases in the market. Out of the 14 cases where they could detect raccoon dog DNA, only one of them could they detect virus RNA. And whereas there was lots of raccoon dog DNA, 1 out of 200 million fragments of genetic material was virus DNA.
Right.
So it doesn't look like that raccoon dog was infected, let alone with that virus. It's certainly not, it's a human version of the virus. So the animal story has fallen apart. No infected animals have been found, and they've tested 80,000 animals now in China, in farms, in the food trade, in wild animals, everything. They cannot find an infected animal. No infected animal vendors or food handlers or chefs or anything like that. And no infected traders, people who go to Yunnan and come back with things to sell in a market. So when, they've looked really hard for it. George Gao, who was head of China's CDC, Centers for Disease Control, he's very emphatic, and he has been since May 2020. This did not start in the market. The market was a amplifying event. It was a place where people went and infected each other. It was a super spreader event early on, but it's not where it started, he says. And he said we'd have found it if it was. He became so vocal on that they've shut him up. And actually the Chinese authorities, they no longer say it started in the market. So it's not just him. That's why they had to go to the lengths of saying it probably came into China from abroad on frozen fish food.
Right.
Right? I mean, where do you get that idea from? That's sort of, and bizarrely, the World Health Organization, to its eternal shame, semi-endorsed that theory. They said, well, it's more plausible than the lab leak, they said in 2021. Well, the idea that this is a lobster virus from Maine doesn't add up, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And there does seem to be a pattern of prominent scientists or scientific institutions saying one thing in public, rubbishing the lab leak in particular in public, while actually in private acknowledging that it could be a possibility. Could you give some examples of that?
Well, this is the most extraordinary part, and for me, the most shocking part, because I'm a huge fan of science. I've championed it for 30 years or more. I think it's humanity's greatest achievement. I think it's a wonderful thing that we do science. So to find scientists conspiring among themselves to tell a different story in public from what they believe in private, which is what we've found, because Congress has subpoenaed the records of the scientists, particularly ones who wrote a very influential paper called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which was published in March of 2020. And there are 5 authors of that paper, and they were commissioned to write that paper by very senior scientists, Anthony Fauci in America and Jeremy Farrar in the UK, among others. And they started off writing a balanced article, but then decided to write an article saying we can rule out that it came out of a lab.
Right.
And the arguments they used were completely flimsy. I mean, they just don't add up at all, we now know. But what was really shocking is that they were sending messages to each other while they were writing this article and preparing to write it and trying to get it through publication in Nature Medicine, saying, I still think it's friggin' likely that it came out of a lab. That's a quote from Christian Anderson, the lead author.
Yeah.
Another one says, I flip-flop day to day thinking maybe it's a lab, maybe it's natural. And they're writing an article saying it cannot possibly be a lab leak. And it's not because they changed their minds in the light of new evidence, which is what they sometimes claim, because they said the same thing after they'd published the article. I mean, even after it comes out, they exchange messages saying, well, yeah, but we still can't rule out that it might have come out of a lab, even while they were giving quotes to the media saying we can rule it out. Now, I think that's scientific misconduct. The paper, I think, should be retracted. I think there's several reasons why it should be retracted. But to do so would be to admit scientific conduct on a scale that the scientific establishment does not want to do. And I'm very shocked by the behavior of the National Academy of Sciences in America, the Royal Society in the UK. They just won't look at this.
Yeah.
They won't even talk about it. They want it to go away. Now, we've got a huge problem with scientific fraud. I mean, there are excellent people on the case of digging out fraudulent scientific behavior in lots of fields these days. It does the reputation of science no good not to investigate potential misconduct, in my view.
Definitely. And you mentioned Dr. Anthony Fauci. I wanted to ask you specifically about him because obviously in the US, if you're a liberal, he's a kind of almost godlike heroic figure. If you're on the right in America, he's something approaching the devil. What's the truth about Dr. Fauci? Where does he fit into this story?
Well, he's an interesting figure. He was the most highly paid US government official when he retired. That's an extraordinary fact, isn't it? He was in that job for something like 32 years. Do we ever put people in public jobs for that long? That's bizarre. It's like J. Edgar Hoover running the FBI for so long. He got the job under the Bush administration. Well, he started as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases long before that. But he got the expanded version of his job after 9/11. After the anthrax scares that followed 9/11, George W. Bush was persuaded to set up a pretty big secret, not secret, but funding stream that was sort of off the table to support biological warfare and biological defense research, and to not channel it through the main funding body so Congress couldn't get its hands on it.
Right.
It was decided to put Anthony Fauci in charge of that, and he didn't want to leave his job as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, so he basically sort of did both jobs. And that put him in a very strong position to fund and influence pretty well every experiment that was going on in terms of really dangerous viruses.
Yeah.
When he realized that the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had been part funded by his own institute, he sends emails that we've now seen saying this is a very important topic. We need to have a conversation, not on the record. We need to talk about this, etc. And his deputy, David Morans, has got some very embarrassing emails where he talks about, whatever you do, you mustn't write stuff that could be got under the Freedom of Information Act. These are not people behaving well, put it like that. Now, Fauci's a very good scientist. He's a very good bureaucrat. He's very good at what he does.
Yeah.
And he's developed this enormously powerful position. But it's pretty clear that if it emerged that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had accidentally caused a pandemic that killed 28 million people, and had done so with a significant chunk of its funding coming from his institute, that he would be embarrassed by that. So he has every incentive to argue, as he has done fervently in public that we must forget about that and not look into it, and it's off the table, and we know it didn't happen. And then the other day he goes before Congress and said, "Look, I've never ruled it out."
Yeah.
And I just don't understand the way these big political figures behave, but it's not the way I would behave.
Yeah, certainly. And is there a scientific defense for some of these kinds of experiments, gain of function experiments, as they're called? These are presumably done in order to prevent the next pandemic, even if obviously it hasn't worked out that way.
Well, the general phrase gain of function is not a bad phrase. If I give wheat plants the ability to resist diseases, I'm giving them a gain of function.
Right.
And that's what we mean in biotechnology by that phrase. And of course, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I think that's great. I think we should do more of it. I think we've done too little of that, actually, particularly in Europe. But giving viruses extra functions so that they become more infectious or more lethal is a very different proposition.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, the decisions by the biotech community to do as many safe experiments as we can, but not to meddle with the really dangerous stuff, got forgotten. And in some kind of a competition to see what we could do, they started souping up viruses in certain labs around the world to make them more dangerous. Now, what did they do in Wuhan with a SARS-like virus, not SARS-CoV-2, but a different SARS-like virus? They swapped a spike gene from another virus into it to see if it made it more infectious. And they infected humanized mice with it, which are mice with human genes. So you're effectively training this virus on human genes while you're doing this, right? And in one of those experiments, they made the virus at least 10,000 times more infectious.
Wow.
Right? And at least 3 times more lethal to the mouse. Now, that is gain of function of concern, to use the technical term. Now, you can argue that that's just a mouse, but it's a mouse with human genes. And it's a close cousin of SARS we're talking about, which is a very dangerous disease, much more dangerous, much more lethal than SARS-CoV-2, actually. And then the experiment that they planned to do with a slightly more distantly related virus, that's what they said, a 20 to 25% genetically different one, was to put this furin cleavage site in, this special sequence into the spike gene, which would enable the virus to infect different tissues in the body than the ones. These viruses in their natural habitat are in the guts of bats. They're not in the lungs. But if you put a furin cleavage site in, basically you make a virus capable of infecting human airway epithelial cells in the lab, which they were going to do, and humanized mice in their lungs. And then, of course, you've got a respiratory infection. So you are gaining the function of a different mode of infection, right? That's the function you're gaining. Is it, are the experiments we're worried about 1% of virology, let alone biotechnology? Probably about that.
Yeah.
Is it therefore easy to say, let's not do those experiments, but let's keep doing the safer ones? Yes, it is very easy to say that. And the whole debate about gain of function blew up about 10 years ago when 2 labs, one in Rotterdam and one in Wisconsin, proposed doing things to a bird influenza virus that would make it into a mammal influenza virus. Now, we're mammals.
Yeah.
And a lot of people said, look, for God's sake, do you really need to do this experiment? Because accidents do happen and so on. And actually in that Wisconsin lab, there was an accident, not with a particularly dangerous virus, and it didn't end up, the researcher didn't get ill, but they got contaminated, as it were, and they sent the chap home.
Yeah.
They didn't isolate him in the lab. They said go home for a week and come back when you feel better. So and that, which was exactly the procedure they had not, different from the procedure they'd agreed to if something went wrong.
Right.
So something is very wrong with the way virologists have been competing with each other to do ever more fancy experiments with viruses that have ever more spectacular results. And what's the motivation here? To publish in Nature.
Yeah.
You don't need to know more than that. This is what scientists do. This is the currency they work in, to get a high-profile publication out of an experiment because it's a pretty spectacular experiment. And you say, right, we're learning more about the virus. And you are learning a bit about the virus, but it's like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. The risk-reward ratio is all wrong.
And other than damage to people's reputation, do you think there might be, say, political reasons for wanting to not have this debate? What else is motivating, for instance, some of the institutions you've talked about, scientific institutions, to want to essentially hope this topic goes away?
Well, Ian Williams has just written a book called Vampire State about the China's approach to the world, and it has some very interesting stuff on the degree to which Western academia has come to depend on Chinese money, Chinese students, Chinese collaborations, and has, as a result, started to pull its punches, not started, but enthusiastically pulled its punches when it comes to any criticism of China and so on. And I'm afraid this is now rampant. I come across this all the time. And I spoke to a very senior scientist who said, look, I really hope we don't find out what happened because of the damage it would do to relations between Western academia and China. And I'm gobsmacked by that. I mean, would you really say that after a plane crash? I really hope we don't find out because of the damage it might do with our relations with Boeing. It's quite a remarkable thing to say, I think. And so I think you can't rule out. Well, in fact, you can specifically rule in, because we've seen emails from Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, saying, we must be careful not to damage international harmony.
Yeah.
What harmony?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm being somewhat flippant. It's not a flippant topic. It's a deadly serious one, and there are some of us who just don't want to walk away from the fact that an episode of human history left a very large number of people dead, an even larger number of people bereaved, and a lot of people with their lives turned upside down. And the possibility of that happening again, or of terrorist organizations learning from it and deciding to go down the biological warfare route, is too frightening to give this topic up.
And finally, do you think there are any other sort of topics where perhaps the corruption or politicization of science is having an effect? I'm thinking, are there any analogies we can draw, for instance, with climate change in this particular disaster?
Well, I'm afraid I do think that more and more scientists see their role as telling us what to do, not finding out facts about the world, as it were. And you see this sort of motivated reasoning in science a lot. You see a lot of confirmation bias, which is when you look for evidence that supports your idea and not for evidence that's against it. You've always seen that to some degree, but it's getting worse because there's been a great politicization of academia. Certain conclusions are good and other conclusions are bad, and therefore we sort of twist our results to get the good and not the bad. I'm sorry to say that does seem to be happening. And in the past, it didn't matter too much because Professor A had a go at Professor B, saying, your paper's full of holes, you don't know what you're talking about. You did that and got the truth out of it. But today, Professor A and Professor B are funded by the same body,
right?
Whether it's the Wellcome Trust in the UK or the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease in America. And you know what Fauci wants you to find out and say. And I talk to American scientists all the time who say, I'd love to put my head above the parapet, but I have NIH grants in my lab.
Yeah.
and I daren't criticize NIH. I don't think that's not a happy situation. You mentioned climate change. I personally think there is a real problem with climate change, that scientists who are studying climate change very much know the answers they want to find.
Yeah.
And if they find a reassuring fact about climate change, they kind of forget about it or try not to. The editors of journals don't like to publish it. We've got lots of evidence for this, that, the good news is just not published and the bad news is exaggerated. And that doesn't mean it's not real and it's not happening, but it means that there is an astonishing amount of bias that has contaminated and corrupted the scientific process. And the whole story of the hockey stick nearly 20 years ago now is a very prescient and alarming example of, in my view, badly done science that was then excused and swept under the carpet and so on.
Matt Ridley, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fraser.